All right, we'll just probably wait for another minute to let everybody join in. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our workshop on SDG 13, organized by Envipol. Envipol is an environmental consulting firm, and we are a newly incorporated organization, and we are working at the cutting edge of systems thinking, game theory, behavioral economics, law, and policy review, focused towards solving some of the toughest challenges that humanity is facing today, such as climate change, including within that air pollution, water pricing, biodiversity. And we are committed to train a lot of, actually, 1 million professionals by 2030 who can help us and help the world solve some of these pressing complex problems that the world is facing. So this workshop today is one of our initiatives to build our community and to train people and give them some hands-on tools to be able to deal with climate change and in particular today air pollution. uh, just some housekeeping things before we move forward with the lecture. Today we will have two sessions. Essentially, this is a workshop which is a combination of two different workshops. The first session is going to be conducted by me, and I'll give you my introduction really soon. The first session is going to be on game theory and climate cooperation. And the second session is going to be organized and delivered by my partner, Ishan, and he's going to be talking about the polluter pays principle and the enviro legal foundations for effective change. A couple of things. Since this is a certificate workshop, we'll be issuing certificates to you that you will receive within a week of the closure of this workshop. So within the next 7 days, all that we expect you to do is to have your full name on your Zoom screen, so that when we are taking attendance, we know who all is attending the workshop and who all do we have to issue the certificate to. That attendance will be taken multiple times during the conversation. So please make sure that you attend both of the workshops. It is only when you attend both of the sessions today that you will be eligible to receive the certificate. So with that, let me introduce myself. My name is Arpit Chaturvedi, and I am the co-founder and chief strategy officer of Envipol. I've told you about Envipol, and one of our current flagship projects at Envipol, which is running right now, is about a global fellowship, and that's called the GPOTS Fellowship, which stands for the Global Policy, Diplomacy, and Sustainability Fellowship. Uh, it's a 3 month long program uh, which brings in people from 14 different countries as mentors. So people including judges from various courts in the United States, in Europe, in India, uh, various diplomats, UN officials, investors, corporate leaders, and ministers, ex ministers, and legislators from all across the world to train people in public policy, diplomacy, and sustainability over a period of 3 months. So, do check out about our fellowship, and we'll be posting about that in our chat group. And one of our alumna, Sulekha Agrawal, will be talking a little bit about the fellowship right after my session and before Ishant's. So, without further ado, let's just jump into the conversation of game theory and climate change. The only thing that I would request you to do is to keep yourself on mute. We will take questions towards the end, but then you can still type in your questions in the chat box. And it's heartening to see people from all around the world, from Ghana, from Puerto Rico, from India, everywhere. So welcome everybody. And here we start with our session. So today we're going to be talking about game theory and climate change. And before we understand how game theory applies to climate change, let's just get some basics of game theories out of the way first. So the first thing is that game theory is essentially an analytical tool. It is a theory that brings in a perspective of costs and benefits and real payoffs when you're making decisions. So it's a strategic decision making theoretical discipline wherein you learn what strategies are available in front of you and how do you navigate through complex situations such as people not following the norms and laws related to climate change. Now, what if I told you game theory is something that we already do, that we already play on a day-to-day basis every day? We might not have learned it formally, but then this is something that we do in our day-to-day lives when we are calculating whether I should go to the grocery store and do my groceries or finish an assignment that I'm supposed to finish right now. You're doing a cost benefit analysis, or whether should I, bargain for a lot more when I'm, negotiating for my job, or whether should I settle at the pay that somebody has given out to me, or when I'm, pursuing somebody to propose them to become my spouse. All of this has an element of game theory in it. And likewise, when we look at climate change, it has an element of game theory in it. Now, a lot of you would wonder that why do we have so much talk about climate change? Everybody is talking about SDGs, everybody's uh, attending all of these webinars about climate change. But still, every time that we see the AQI levels rising, we see the air pollution increasing, and we see marine life and biodiversity in general being damaged. And the reason is that laws or policies, until they are not reaching a particular equilibrium, and we'll talk about the equilibria over here, as long as they are not designed to bring people to an equilibrium, they are just ink on paper. So laws and policies cannot be implemented if they are not bringing people towards a particular equilibrium. Aditi, if I might request you to please mute the audience, if that's all right. Yeah. Okay, so three principles of game theory. First things first, you need to remember that in the formal modeling of game theory, people are considered to be rational. So everybody in game theory is a person who's calculating their cost benefits, and they are trying to minimize their costs and maximize their benefits. That's what we mean by people being rational in game theory. Now, in reality, I must give you a footnote over here. In reality, people may not be rational all the time. People operate under bounded rationality, and that's the perspective that behavioral economics brings in, and I'll touch upon that a little bit. But for ease of analysis, we say that in game theory, people are rational. The second principle over here is that rationality is common knowledge. So what I mean by rationality is common knowledge, that I know that you are rational, you know that I'm rational, I know that you know that I'm rational, and so on and so forth. So I know if I'm playing a game against Malika, so Malika over here, who's another GPODS alumna, I know that Malika has a profit maximizing behavior. So if we are negotiating for something, or if we are doing a deal, then I know that Malika would like to play in a manner that she maximizes her own profit and minimizes her losses. And she knows that I will be playing like that as well. And I know that Malika knows that I am a profit maximizer as well. And so on and so forth. So that's a common knowledge of rationality. Not only are you rational, you know that others are rational, and you know that others know that you are rational. So that's really important for us to understand before we head into game theory. And the third bit is equilibrium. And in game theory, we talk a lot about something called a Nash equilibrium. And a Nash equilibrium, you must have seen that movie, A Beautiful Mind, where it's the story of the life of John Nash, who eventually won a Nobel Prize for it. And he popularized the concept of a Nash equilibria, which is a strategy, uh, a strategy that you have adopted, and you would not change that adopted strategy given the current set of payoffs that you have. And we'll deep dive a little bit further into that. But then essentially, you can think of Nash equilibria is, if again Malika and I are playing a game, and if we have both decided to, let's say, you know, we have both decided that, okay, we are not going to throw our trash in the dustbin. Okay. Or we have both decided that we are going to throw our trash in the dustbin. Whatever strategic choices we have made, it is not in either of our favors to deviate unilaterally from that strategic choice. I'll give you examples, and that's where you will understand it. But conceptually, Nash equilibria is a place where nobody unilaterally benefits from deviating from their current strategic choices. Yeah. So just to start understanding what this really is, uh, a question that comes to people's mind is that, or that comes to my mind a lot, or a lot of game theorists' minds, is that why do countries decide to drive on one side of the road? So let's say if you're in India, everybody drives on the left side of the road, and it's official policy that in India we drive on the left side of the road, and in the United States it's official policy that we drive on the right side of the road. But why don't we have any country where there is no official policy like that, where people are free to choose on a random day as to which side of the road that they want to drive on? So they could, one day I wake up and I say that, okay, I'm going to drive on the left side of the road. Another day I wake up and I decide that, okay, today I'm not feeling left so much, I'm just going to drive on the right side of the road. Well, the logic is simple, because it's in people's collective interest to drive on one side of the road. And people get this really easily, that if everybody can just decide, and left side is no better than the right side, but if everybody can just decide that I am going to drive on this side of the road, then everyone is going to be better off. Because if you're driving on the opposite side of the road, there's going to be a crash, and you're going to be uh, you know in a situation where you're making a loss. So if you look at this game, it looks like this. So in all of game theory, and today's lecture especially, I'm just going to use these simple matrices where one person is this one who plays like this, up and down cells, and the other person is over here. So you can call it the society, or you could call it another person, and this person plays left and right. Okay. And over here they have different strategies. In this particular case, this is left and right, and their strategies could also have been cooperate or not cooperate, but then everybody has a set of strategies over here. So let's say again, two players in this game, one is the society and one is me, and we both decide that we are going to drive towards the left. Okay. Another way to put it is that you could also say that the society is just made of two people. One is myself, one is another imagined person. Okay. So maybe Asif over here. So I am one player, Asif is another player. And if we both decide to drive on the left side of the road, we get a 5-5. We are not crashing into each other. Things are good. Okay. And alternatively, in another country, maybe somebody else, Crystal and Malika, they decide that they're going to be driving on the right side of the road. And simply, that also works out pretty well. Now, the thing is that these two are Nash equilibria over here. Why? Because Asif over here would not want to, if everybody in the society is driving on the left, Asif has no incentive to unilaterally change his strategy from left to right. Because the moment he does that, there are car crashes and everybody is in a loss, right? So there is absolutely no incentive for Asif to do that. Similarly, Crystal would have no incentive. If Crystal is the other player over here, uh, Crystal would have no incentive to again move from left to right, because the same story. If everyone is driving to the left, you're better off driving with the left. In similar parlance, if everyone is driving to the right, Malika has no incentive of moving from 5 to -1 or from right to the left. And similarly, I have no incentive of moving from 5 to -1. I play like this and Malika plays like this. All right. So this right, right, and left, left, these are the two Nash equilibria in this game. Now, the thing is that since this game has two Nash equilibria, these policies, if there is a policy or if there's a law that in our country, we are just going to drive on the left side of the road and this left, left forms a Nash equilibria, this becomes a law which is easily enforceable. It does not need so many policemen or so many people, cameras monitoring you just to make sure that you're driving on the left. Since this constitutes an equilibrium, people automatically get it. People understand that it's in everyone's self-interest to be driving on one side, whichever side that is. So the idea behind any successful law or policy is to nudge people towards a particular equilibrium, right? However, the problem is that when we are talking about a lot of policies, especially in terms of global commons or things such as clean air or things such as potable water, the Nash equilibria over there is not a good Nash equilibria, just like you have over here. So we'll just get into that in a little bit. So here it is. You talk about a lot of these things, such as clean air or just a peaceful society to live in, or national defense. All of these things that the government needs to provide to you, they are public goods. Or, for example, adequate amount, an adequate level of biodiversity. All of these are public goods because they benefit the public in general, and they have two features. So we use the word public good in common parlance quite loosely, but then the economic students over here would understand that public goods have two particular features, which are non-excludability and non-rivalry. Non-excludability simply means that you pay for it, you get it. You don't pay for it, you still get it. So think of things like clean air, right? So if I'm living in a city which has a lot of clean air, I pay my taxes, let's say, I still get it. I don't pay my taxes, I still get clean air. Similarly, national defense, right? Another feature of a public good is that they also have to be non-rival. So non-rival is that my consumption of that good does not diminish your consumption of that good. So for example, sunlight, if I'm getting good sunlight, and if I am out there sitting and enjoying the sunlight, that does not diminish the amount of sunlight that your body can absorb. Or if I'm breathing the clean air, I'm not sucking out of the clean air out of your quota. So if something, again, national defense, if the Army, Air Force, Navy is protecting me, that does not mean that if I add another person in the society, the amount of protection that they enjoy is going to go down. So the idea over here is that public goods, they have these two properties. Okay. Now, similarly, there are other types of goods as well. There are common resource pools. So, for example, I've had a debate with a professor, and I concede in that particular case where potable water, clean water, is a common resource good. It's not a public good because it is, in many senses, it is rival. It is non-excludable. It is rival. So, for example, think of potable water, or think of fishes in a particular pond. The nature of that is that you don't have to pay to fish at the seashore or to fish in a pond, but at the same time, your consumption of those fishes diminishes my consumption of those fishes, or your consumption of potable water diminishes my consumption of potable water, because water, I don't quote me on the exact figure, but then I think only I was reading the stat that only 4 to 5% of the total water on the earth is actually potable, and then there's a limited regenerative capacity of the water. If you if you're not able to regenerate that water enough, then you're going to run out of clean water to be had. So a lot of these things that we are dealing with in the environment, in the nature, they fall into either the category of common resource pool or public goods. Now, there are also other types of goods, such as quasi-public goods, which are excludable and non-rival. These are also called club goods. So, for example, cable TV. So you pay for it, and then you make 10 people sit in front of it. You make 20 people sit in front of it. One's consumption does not diminish another's consumption, but you only get it if you pay for it. If you don't pay for it, you don't get it, right? And the final one is pretty simple. It's private goods. It's rival, it's excludable. You pay for it, you get it, and one's consumption diminishes another person's consumption. Quick example before we move forward, just to make this concept clear, is that you go to a bus station or a tube station, and a person is playing a saxophone on the street or on the station. It's a public good at that point of time. You put a coin in the person's hat, you still enjoy the music. You don't pay for it, you still enjoy the music, right? But what if I want to convert it into a club good? What I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a soundproof box, or I'm going to put this person inside a stadium. You pay a ticket, you get it, you hear the sounds. But then if there are 10 people, 20 people, 30 people, one's consumption does not reduce another's consumption. Okay. And then if you want to make it a private good, then what you do is you simply publish CDs, or you simply publish MP3s that people have to buy songs for personal consumption in their iPods. One thing that you might notice is that the world that we are living in right now, you'd see a lot of public goods being converted into private goods gradually, just the way that the market functions. For example, clean air, typically it's a public good, but then with so much emerging population, because pollution because of industrialization, it is only if you're living in a lot of times a very developed country that you'll be able to enjoy clean air. And to live in a country like that, you will have to be able to incur a lot of expenses. So that becomes excludable gradually. So from a public good, to be able to afford clean air, you have to live in a place which is very expensive. So it becomes a quasi-public or a club good. And now I am hearing of some new companies which are also selling fresh air in bottles. So, you could breathe Ladakh air in a bottle with a mask on it. So you've converted air into a pure private good, and you have that with mineral water as well, right? So common pool resource converted into a private good. So that's one challenge that we are facing, and we need to figure out why we do that, or we need to figure out that why, despite the fact that all of these things have a regenerative capacity, whether you talk about biodiversity, whether you talk about clean air or water, they have a regenerative capacity, but still we end up abusing it and we end up diminishing it. And the problem over here is that we are stuck in a bad equilibrium. We are stuck in a prisoner's dilemma over here. So it's almost like not being able to keep your streets clean. So people who are in developing countries would see that, when they're in a developing country, you walk around the road and you see that, people tend to litter on the street. The reason why they do it is that, they think that, what am I going to gain if I am the only person? What am I going to change if I'm the only person who is putting my trash in the trash can? It's not going to change anything, but then I'm going to just incur the cost of going all the way to the trash can every time and dumping my trash over here while everybody is freely littering on the street. So I would think that I would not want to be in a position where I pay the costs. Others, they don't pay the cost. They are chilling in life. They are reaping the benefits and nothing really changes. And the others are also thinking in the same way. So it's, you're stuck in a bad equilibrium. You do that with air pollution all the time. We think that, we would want to move towards an electric vehicle, or we want to adopt a more sustainable lifestyle. But a lot of times we don't do that, or we want to just use solar energy for our personal household consumption. But a lot of times we don't do that is because we think that if I am playing a cooperative game with the nature. So, let's say there are two strategies: cooperate and non-cooperate. And cooperate means adopting a sustainable lifestyle. So if I am doing that, and if the rest of the world is not doing it, nothing's going to change. And I will be at a disadvantage because I'm the one who's paying the costs. And others, they are just, they're not really doing anything about it. And similarly, since common knowledge of rationality, others also are thinking in rational terms, others are also thinking the same. So nobody is really coming together and solving the problem of collective action over there. And it's almost like this: if I were to simulate it in a game, it's almost like this. Let's say, in the world, we have finite resources, right? And we can use those finite resources in a way that we are able to divide them or use them efficiently, use them, you know, uh, in a manner that they have a regenerative capacity, or we could really abuse them. Okay. So let's say, you play a game with nature. Okay. There are two players, you and the nature. But to simplify that, let's say that the resources in the world, they are these 5 apples, and the players, there are 2 of us. So I see Shehu over here. So Shehu and I will play this game. All right. And there are 5 apples. They are kept in a room. Okay. So let's say they are kept in a classroom and we meet outside. And we say that we are going to play a cooperative game, Shehu. We are going to go inside, we're going to act civil, and we are just going to divide up those apples equally so that we both have enough. Okay? So one is nature and one is me. We both have enough. Okay, so you can regenerate, I can live. So outside, we go and we decide that we are just going to cooperate, divide it up 2.5, and we're ready to go. But then I start thinking that what if I go there inside? What if I go there inside and the other person defects? And you can think of it in terms of nature. You can think of it in terms of the other person being another citizen, another industry, other corporation. So what if I go in with the intention of cooperating and the other person defects? Okay, so I end up with 0 and the other person, leaves the room with all the 5 apples. I don't want that. Yeah, I'm a rational person, right? And similarly, the other person would probably be thinking like that as well, right? So what if I turn to renewable energy, I buy my electric car and I spend so much more money on that, and think of it as a country making this decision. Let's say, I am a developing country, for example, I am India, and I spend a lot on this, and Bangladesh probably doesn't. So in comparative terms, Bangladesh is ahead of me in the development game. And similarly, Bangladesh would think the same, that, what if I am doing this and India doesn't do it? And you see this playing out in, agreements such as the Paris Agreement. You would see this playing out in bilateral treaties between nations where they are not able to come to an agreement to actually take actions. A lot of times they'll do it on paper, but then on actually taking actions to reduce real pollution or to change their supply chains in a manner that they are more eco-friendly, they would not do it because they don't want to fall behind the development game, right? And you are stuck in this sort of a prisoner's dilemma where eventually, when Shehu and I, we get into the room, we are thinking that, okay, Shehu is thinking Arpit might just grab on all the apples and I will stand, like an innocent civil person. And Arpit is also thinking like that. So eventually, despite the fact that we have agreed to cooperate, when we are inside the room, we are going to pounce upon the apples. We are probably going to enter into a scuffle and destroy 1 apple out of those 5 and leave with 2 to each, right? So look at this over here. We could have left with 2.5 apples, but we ended up with 2 and 2 each. And the problem is that if you think about things rationally, defecting is the only good strategy over here. Because if I'm defecting, let's say this is me, and if I'm defecting, I get a 2. And if I'm defecting and Shehu is defecting, I get a 2. But let's say Shehu eventually turns out to be a nice and cooperative guy, and Shehu cooperates, then I leave with a 5. So in either case, defect is my Nash equilibrium. I do not gain anything to unilaterally move from defect to cooperate and go from 2 to 0. Similarly, Shehu doesn't gain anything to unilaterally move from defect to cooperate over here. This becomes a Nash equilibrium. It's easy to see that cooperate is a better strategy set. It is not a Nash equilibrium. Why is it not a Nash equilibrium? Because I would over here not want to move from 2.5. I would not over here want to move from 2.5 to 0, and Shehu would not want to move from 2.5 to 0, right? So if we are both cooperating, then we would not want to reduce our chances of enjoying as much as we perhaps could have, right? So 2.5 is not a Nash equilibrium. 2 and 2 is a Nash equilibrium. And when you are dealing with policies, wherein the Nash equilibrium is a suboptimal one, then it is going to be hard to enforce those policies. So you would need the government to come in, to step in, to enforce those policies. So over here, let's say, what does the government want to do? The moment I think that, let's say, in a hypothetical scenario, the society has somehow, in an ideal world, the society should be here. So what the government does, so one way to escape falling into a Nash equilibrium, which is this, is that the moment I think that, okay, let me change my strategy from cooperate to defect and let me come from 2.5 to 5, the government steps in. So because if I come over here, then Shehu is left with nothing. I'm left with 5. I'm running away, being just this, violent and reckless sort of a person. The government says that the moment you defect and the others are cooperating, I'm going to put a tax on you, or I'm going to put a penalty on you. And let's say I'm going to put a penalty of 3 over here, okay? Or I'm going to put a penalty of 4 over here. And if I have put a penalty of 4, this 5 turns into a 1, right? So now I have no incentive to move from 2.5 to 1. Earlier, I had incentive that, okay, I could run with all of the apples. It's almost like if I'm running out of that room with all of the 5 apples, there'll be a guard standing outside and be like, Arpit, I see you with all of the 5 apples. That means that you played defect and the other guy played cooperate. Give me 4 of those apples and you're going to be left with 1 just because you defected. That's what the government's supposed to do. That's one thing that the government can do. But as you would see that in developing countries, especially, governments have limited enforcement capacities. Okay, so that becomes a problem. Likewise, you can understand that the government would again step in if Shehu moves from cooperate to defect, and if Shehu is running out of the room with 5 apples, the government steps in and says, "Give me 4 of those," and Shehu is at 1. So it's not in Shehu's interest to move from here to here. So what the government is doing, that if you look at this in this way, that this is 2, 2, 1, 0, 0, 1, 2.5, 2.5, then this game has 2 Nash equilibria. Again, that one Nash equilibria is this 2, 2, because don't want to move from 2 to 0, don't want to move from 2 to 0. And one Nash equilibria is 2.5, 2.5, don't want to move from 2.5 to 1, don't want to move from 2.5 to 1. So there is at least a good Nash equilibria over here that the government has created just through the power of its enforcement. Okay. So one way of government, for the government to deal with such policies is this. But as you see, if you look at the Paris Climate Agreement, if you look at a lot of these international treaties, there's no universal body that has enforcement capacity. Right? There's no universe. It's only nations who can self-enforce. things. Nobody can impose anything on the nation. So in the absence of this universal capacity to enforce, it's hard. It's really hard for nations to just cooperate on the climate agenda. And how do you solve that? We'll just come to that real quickly. But then a bit of behavioral economics over here. Now, another thing is that the government really does not have to spend an enforcement capacity of 4. Because in behavioral economics, we know that losses, they weigh or they loom larger than gains in terms of the human psyche. So human beings, they are more scared of the losses than they are attracted to profits, or they are attracted to gains. So what the government simply has to do, and a lot of researchers, they say that uh, people, they are scared of losses, or they value losses at a factor of 1.5 to 2.5 times uh, than the actual payoff, and especially if you compare it to gains. So for example, the government puts a tax of 2, and let's say people's loss aversion factor is 2.5, right? Sorry, 2.5. Then this becomes a 5 over here. So people would perceive that punishment as equivalent to, a loss of 5 units of utility. So what the government the government doesn't even have to impose an enforcement capacity of 4. The government can just impose an enforcement capacity of 2.5. And since people are more afraid of losses than they value gains, this is probably going to be enough. But then the challenge over here is that experimentally you'll have to find out the loss aversion factor of that particular population. So that was just a side on the behavioral economics front. Now, another thing that you need to understand is that cooperation is not, achieved only by enforcement. There are other ways of doing that as well. And another way of doing that is infinite games. And before we get into that, let's look at finite games. And uh, you'll understand pretty quickly now. Let's say the same game that Shehu and we were playing over various stages. Uh, Now, this same game is played in 4 stages. So we play that same game of distributing the apples on 4 different days. But now Shehu knows that on the 4th day, I would want to maximize, because there's no, there's no world after that. There's no, we both of us seeing each other after that. So let's say on the 4th day, Shehu knows that even if we are cooperating on the other days, on the 4th day, I am likely to defect, because I want to leave with 5 and Shehu wants to leave with 0. So Shehu will defect over here already, right? And if Shehu knows that I'm going to defect in the last round, Shehu would think that, okay, maybe if we have decided to cooperate all along and in the last round we are both going to defect, and Shehu being the maximizer that he is, he says, okay, let me defect in the last round. So let me just play this game over here. I am going to defect, and Arpit is probably going to cooperate. But remember the common knowledge of rationality. Arpit is then going to think that I know that Shehu is rational, so Shehu must be thinking like this. So let me defect in the second last round. Similarly, Shehu would think, let me defect in the second round itself. And similarly, I would backward calculate and I would defect in the first round as well, and so would Shehu. And we would only play the defect game until the end, because that remains the only Nash equilibrium, right? What is the way out of it? The way out of it is that you create a game that runs until infinity. So if it is a game that the both of us have to play every day, then we have one option that one day we can maximize and one day we defect, but after that every day the other person is going to defect on you, and then you're stuck in 2 all the way until the end, right? And if you add it up for long enough, that doesn't come out to be as the Nash equilibrium, and there's no backward calculation that can take place. Okay, so essentially, if you have a game that runs until infinity, you can expect cooperation. Although in Infinity also you can, since there's so many players, you can get stuck in the defect version, but you can also come out of it if you're playing an infinite game. I'm not getting into the details over there. But the thing is that what does it mean in terms of the climate crisis? What does it mean when we are talking about things like air pollution? So my personal opinion is that when we say that, okay, by 2022 or by 2030, if we don't do that, then we are doomed, right? And if people really think that they cannot do much by 2030, and there's an end date to that cooperation, and if people think that when we're in 2029, that's when people would have realized that nothing much is going to happen, and that's when corporations are, or people are just going to burn the fuel like crazy, and they're going to go berserk. So people are expecting others to play a game of defect in 2029. So if I'm expecting others to defect in 29, then in 28 I will defect, and then similar back calculations, then in 27 another person who knows that I'm going to defect in 28 is going to defect in 27, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to defect, and I'm not going to unilaterally move to a more sustainable lifestyle. The way to move unilaterally to a more sustainable lifestyle is to understand that you will be in this game forever. You will be in this game until infinity. And once you understand that, you realize that it makes sense to play the cooperate game and get to a higher level of payoffs rather than just be stuck in a bad equilibrium. So infinite games, that's one. Another one is, and this typically works with common pool resources. This is the institutions game. So let's say, we are talking about potable water, or let's say we are talking about biodiversity. So a classic way of explaining is this, imaginary pool where, or an imaginary pond where there are 100 fishes that exist. And there are 5 households that live, the pond is dotted with these 5 households on its borders. And each household, let's say, has to just depend on the fish that they can draw from the pond for their own survival. So there's no other thing that they can eat. It's just the fish that they can eat. And now the way that this, the fishes, they replenish, or the replenishment threshold, what we call in this pond, is that as long as there are at least 50 fishes in the pond, they will be able to regenerate for the next month around. And if any of these households, or if the total drawing out of this pond for these households in a month is such that they draw more than 50 fishes out of the pond, then the fishes will not be able to reproduce at the rate that the pond would be sustainable. Okay. And that happens with a lot of our resources, right? If you look at clean water, if you look at, just air pollution, there's a regenerative capacity, or even biodiversity. If you look at various species, there's a regenerative capacities in this species. And if you exploit it beyond a particular threshold, they go extinct. And, we are in a place where 99% of the species in the world have already gone extinct. So the thing over here is, now what should ideally be the case for all of these households? Ideally, they should draw 10 fishes each. There are 5 households. They should draw 10 fishes each for their sustenance in a month. Okay. But what tends to happen is that, this household, here's where we bring in the free rider problem. This household goes, members of this household go, and they say, okay, let me just draw 11 fishes this month. Nobody is watching, right? So I'm just going to draw out 11 fishes. Nobody's going to really know. And then this household goes, they also want to maximize, and they're like, okay, let me draw out more than 10, which is my share for a month, and let me draw out 11. And similarly, everyone does that. And lo and behold, you're in a situation where 55 fishes have been drawn out, and the regenerative capacity of the pond is lost. Now, what is the way out of it? Essentially, this is very similar to the previous game that we were looking at. Not exactly the same, but very similar, where people are playing the non-cooperative strategy. because they think that they will not be punished because of that, right? Now, one way to do it is that you create an institution. So in terms of this game, an institution could be get a person who's living in a nearby village, okay? Get this person to come over here. This person comes here and sets up a platform and says that now anybody who fishes over here will only fish through this platform. And once they are out, once they're coming out from their fishing, I'm going to note down how many fishes did they draw on this board, which is visible to everybody. So making others' actions transparent. So what you're essentially doing is that bridging the information asymmetry that exists between players. So all that this person is doing is that writing down how many fishes did each household withdraw from the pond each month. And if somebody has withdrawn, let's say this person was trying to act smart and they withdrew 11 fishes this month, then the other households would enforce discipline on this particular person. So you don't need a global government to enforce discipline. You can just have other players enforce discipline if all of them know, or if the information is transparent. So maybe if this person has drawn 11 fishes this month, then the next month the other houses will ensure that this person just draws out 9 fishes. Or if this person again draws out 11 fishes, then take 2 of them and distribute it amongst the others. So this becomes a self-enforcing sort of a mechanism in the absence of a universal government. And the final one is that make cooperation really, really lucrative. So what that means is that, if it pays you a lot to be cooperative, then you will play the cooperative game. So let me give you an example over here. And this is a classic example of how we deal with taxation. And again, the free rider problem arises over here, and there's a bad Nash equilibrium over here. So let's say there are 2 players over here, Ronald and Donald. And they both have to, and I've written 1 unit of energy over here, but you could just consider it $1. All right. So let's say that they have to pay $1 in taxes every year towards something that is a public good. So let's say they have to give $1 for subsidizing clean energy. Okay. So the way that public goods again function, remember that they are non-rival, non-excludable. You pay for it, you get it. You don't pay for it, you still get it. And my consumption does not reduce your consumption. Okay. So over here, what happens is that both of them, they pay $1. And since it is a public good, another feature of public good is that, it gives you greater returns. The return on there's a positive return on investment in public goods. So if, again, to simplify it and give you another example, rather than keeping individual bodyguards for yourself, it is more beneficial for a nation to pool in their resources and create a national army. So there's a positive return on investment over there because there are returns to scale, etc., etc. So let's say that there is a 1.5 factor in return to investment. So they pool in 1 unit, or $1, $1. A common pool is $2. They invest it into subsidizing clean energy, or they invest it in clean tech, and the returns that they get is 1.5 times of that, which is $3. And then eventually, since you pay for it, you get it, and everyone gets it. Both of these guys, after investing $2, it becomes $3, and that gets split into 1.5. So both of these guys, they end up with $1.5 in total. Right? This is fairly simple. You invest $1 in clean energy, and that common pool of $2 gives you $3, and then you eventually are the beneficiaries of your investment. So you get 1.5 each. It's a nice profit, right? But let's say Donald decides to act smart. Another scenario could be that Donald doesn't pay his taxes. and Ronald does. So Ronald pays $1 in taxes. Donald keeps his $1 to himself, does not give out the taxes. So now the investment in clean energy is just $1. But clean energy is still a good thing. So that $1 will be multiplied by 1.5, and that $1.5, since you pay for it, you get it. You don't pay for it, you still get it. So both Ronald and Donald, they still enjoy the benefits of the investment in clean tech. Okay. And over here, what happens is that when you divide that 1.5, and that gets divided equally because it's a public good. So Ronald gets a $0.5 unit of energy. Okay. And Donald gets 0.75 in addition to the $1 that he never spent in the first place. So if you look at this, then Donald is the free rider, but Donald is still in a more beneficial position. Now, likewise over here, there could be just the opposite situation where Ronald doesn't pay and Donald has paid. And similarly, Ronald has his original $1 and plus the 0.75, and Donald ends up with 0.75. Okay. So this is exactly the opposite of this. So one person pays, another doesn't pay. And there could be a final scenario where both of them, they say that, okay, I'm not going to pay. Let me just, or in a way that, okay, let's not have a national army. We're just going to have our own bodyguards. Right. So both of them end up with 1-1 each. Now it's easy to see that the Nash equilibrium over here is this, which is both defecting. So if Ronald says that, I will pay the tax, then Ronald ends up from defect to cooperate from 1 to 0.75. Similarly, if Donald says that, okay, instead of defecting, instead of saving up on my tax dollars, I'm going to pay my tax dollars towards clean energy, Donald ends up at 0.75, and they don't want to do that. Right? So this becomes a Nash equilibrium over here. Okay. And it's easy to see why this is not a Nash equilibrium, because if you're here, then again, definition of Nash equilibrium is a strategy from which nobody is incentivized to change their strategy, right? So if you're here, you would want to move from 1.5 to, Ronald would want to move from 1.5 to 1.75. So this is not a stable strategy. Okay, the moment Ronald comes over here, Donald thinks that, okay, I'm going in loss, let me also defect, and eventually you're going to end up here. Right, so this is the only Nash equilibrium which exists, despite the fact that there was a good factor of returns in the investment. Right, but let's do one thing. Let's increase the return in investment from 1.5 to 2.5. Okay, and let's see how that changes the game. So scenario one, again, both are playing the cooperative game. Both pay their $1 towards clean tech. Okay, and it gives them a return of 2.5. So I've written returns to scale, but read it as return to investment. So both get 2.5. Both create a pool of 2, which gets multiplied into 2.5, and total benefit for the society is 5 units. And that 5 units gets distributed amongst the both of them, and you have 2.5 units each. Okay, so if both are playing the nice cooperative sort of game, they end up with a cushy 2.5. But then let's say again, Donald not cooperating, Donald doesn't pay his taxes, and Ronald still pays his taxes. So the common pool becomes 1 when Ronald invests $1. It gets multiplied by 2.5. But now Ronald gets 1.25. Donald also gets 1.25. But eventually Donald ends up with 2.25 because Donald has withheld. He has not paid his first installment, or the first time when he was supposed to pay his taxes, he did not. So Donald has his 2.25, while Ronald just has 1.25. 1.25 because he invested his $1 and that split up between the two of them. So this guy is ending at a loss. And similarly, there could be another situation where Ronald doesn't pay his taxes, Donald does. So, again, the pool is 1, it gets multiplied by 2.5, 2.5 split equally amongst the two. So Ronald gets 1.25 and Ronald already has had his $1 and Donald 1.25 despite having spent money towards the taxes. So now eventually the other strategy could be both of them, they don't pay any taxes and they end up with 1. So if you look at this game now, this is interesting in a way, because now this is not the Nash equilibrium. Defect is not the Nash equilibrium if you look at the payoffs over here, because if you are here, then would you want to change your strategy? Would Ronald want to change his strategy from 1 to 1.5? Yes. And would Donald want to change his strategy from 1 to 1.5? Yes. This is the Nash equilibrium over here, cooperate. Look at this. If you are over here, if Ronald is over here, would Ronald want to move from 2.5 to 2.25? No. And would Donald want to move from 2.5 to 2.25? No. So this becomes a stable Nash equilibrium. Now, what's the difference between the two? Both were fairly similar, right? But then, on the left side, this is the one where the multiplier was 1.5 or the return on investment was 1.5. And over here, the return on investment was 2.5. Same behavior, same strategies. Okay. So strategies were like you both pay the taxes, you both don't pay the taxes, or just one person pays the taxes. But in one of them, the return was low and the other one had a higher return. All right. The difference over here is that in the second case where you had an investment factor of 2.5, unilateral defection was not as lucrative as mutual cooperation. Right. So if you look at it in terms of, international space explorations, you see even Russia and the United States coming together. Why? Because going it alone is not as lucrative as cooperating in that particular scenario. Right. So in cases where unilateral defection is, or, unilaterally just going it alone or not cooperating or, not contributing your dues, leaves you in a worse situation than mutual cooperation, or mutual cooperation is a lot more beneficial than going it alone. Those are the places where cooperate becomes a Nash equilibrium. If you look at the left panel over here, you see that going it alone is this strategy for Ronald and this strategy for Donald. Sorry, over here. So 1.75 is greater than 1.5 here for Donald, and 1.75 is greater than 1.5 here for Ronald. So for Ronald, unilateral defection is better than mutual cooperation. So that's why the Nash equilibrium is defect. But over here, if you look at it again, unilateral defection for Ronald is not as good as mutual cooperation. And similarly for Donald, mutual cooperation is better than unilateral defection. And what has happened over here, just one thing has changed. Cooperation has become a lot more lucrative. So the returns on investment or the returns on cooperation are just a lot better. So another thing that the society can do is increase the payoff of cooperation, or, in our case, when we are looking at climate change, create a belief that not only if we move to a sustainable lifestyle, are we going to be better off overall, we are going to be better off than we have ever been before. So if you really create a sense that, okay, if we are able to avert the crisis, so right now, the way that we think about climate change is that, there's this crisis that is coming, there's this meteor which is going to strike us, and we got to deflect that meteor, right? And for deflecting that meteor, we got to go electric, we got to have a sustainable lifestyle, etc. And once we have deflected that meteor, then crisis averted, we are living in a good world. Now, instead of deflecting that meteor, if we think that this is something that we need to do to live an even better life than we have ever lived before, so it doesn't look like a compromise, it looks like an opportunity which gives us a lot greater returns. It is only then when we create that sort of a mindset that people will perceive the game to be this game, right? Until then, we're going to be stuck in this sort of a defect equilibrium. So that's it for today. There's a lot more that we can cover in game theory, but then we teach three different courses in our global policy, diplomacy, and sustainability, the GPOTS fellowship. And over there, we get into details of how these game theoretical frameworks interact with systems thinking, or interact with behavioral economics or comparative studies. We apply these frameworks in sustainable development and international relations and diplomacy, and through theoretical discussions, also through case studies. So I would encourage you to check out the GPOTS fellowship. The application deadline is tomorrow for that. And now, before we head to Ishant's lecture, I would like to invite one of our very own GPOTS alumna, Sulekha Agrawal, to talk about her experience of the fellowship. Over to Sulekha. And before Sulekha, you jump in, please do send your messages in the chat box. And if you've sent your messages on the chat box, if you have queries, then we will get back to you with our replies over emails. Or if we have some time towards the end, we can probably take a few of those. Sulekha, over to you.
So thank you, Arpit. Hello, everyone. My name is Sulekha Agrawal. I'm from the first GPOTS cohort. So before I begin, a bit about myself. I am a lawyer from India. I'm practicing at the High Court of the state of Sikkim, which is in Northeast India. And I represent the state on development matters. Before that, I worked with the United Nations, several branches, UN Environment, the International Law Commission, and also a bit of a stint with the Kofi Annan Foundation. I have my bachelor's in law from the University of Mumbai and a master's in international law from the Graduate Institute, Geneva. But I'm not here to talk about myself. I am here to talk about GPOTS and why particularly GPOTS for me. So the reason why I applied to GPOTS was because of this nexus that the fellowship brings, right? So you have global policy, diplomacy, and sustainability. And while they seem like these three different units, they're really important. And that's what my experience working with the United Nations actually showed me. And it also showed me that I had a lot of knowledge gaps, training gaps in my legal education, which was extremely focused. And that is why I decided to go ahead with the fellowship. So like Arpit already mentioned, there were three modules. So one was the Comparative Public Administration, International Political Economy, and Global Commons Seminar. And CPA was the most interesting. So the Comparative Public Administration module was the most interesting to me, particularly because of the methodology. And you've already had a glimpse into the kind of methodology you'd be taught in Arpit's lecture. And this is extremely important because you can have all these ideas that you want to express to whichever, doesn't matter from which field you come from, especially if you want to express it as a policy, you need to be able to present it in a way which is comprehensible to everyone. So which is why this particular model was of great interest to me. And just to give you a more bit of a detail, so once you move into the course, you have these different ways of looking at one problem, something that's called systems thinking. So turns out the way I approached my academia and the way I approached my research was in fact systems thinking, but I never had a vocabulary. I never had a word to put in terms of what I was doing. And that actually elevated in the way I present my research these days. So that was one thing. And then again, international political economy. like I mentioned, I'm from a legal background. But again, when you go into negotiations at the international level, you need to know how a state is going to behave, or at least more or less predict. And that's why it's very important to know the kind of ideologies, the school of thinking that you come from, especially when you come to sustainability. I mean, all of us know it's the difference between a Biden and a Trump. So that was, again, very interesting. And also the interlinkages, because we would like to think that given the climate crisis that we are facing, and which is only going to aggravate, everyone's going to put that on the forefront. But that doesn't happen. There are defense concerns, there are economic concerns. And all of these need to be addressed before you actually come down to sustainability, right? So again, that was extremely enriching, especially just the diversity of the teachers that they were teaching. They come from extremely reputed institution. It just kind of gives you a glimpse into how everyone from these different institutes approach the way they look at subjects. So that was a bit of a behavioral insight I got into it. And of course, the Global Commons seminar. So that was one area that I was very well versed in. But again, just learning from the inputs of my cohort actually made me challenge things that I took for granted and I was extremely sure about in terms of concepts. So that was a bit about the courses. But again, I think the highlight that you take out from these 3 courses was the multidisciplinary perspective. And that really got challenged when you moved on to the case studies. So we had these cases, fictitious or otherwise, being presented to us, and the cohort was divided into groups. So you were actually representing stakeholders, be it government, the civil society, the people in general. And then it turned out that so what you would call a like-minded cohort actually got into the behavior, and suddenly you had to negotiate with people, extremely tough negotiations. And that's when you actually try to understand, do I even know how to communicate? And that comes down to the basis of all things, just learning communication by doing and how to apply what you've learned the best way you can. So that was something that was extremely challenging and very interesting. But one of the biggest highlights for me was the peer-to-peer learning. So at least in my cohort, there was this diversity of backgrounds that people drew from. So you had politicians, anthropologists, just to name a few, public policy people, lawyers like myself. And just to come to a consensus, because you have one thing and you have, like, let's say 30 different ways of looking at that one thing. So just to be challenged by your peers and just to be told that maybe you could look at it in a different way, that peer-to-peer learning was extremely important. And also just not only in terms of the interaction you had during your classes, but we had this something amazing called virtual cafe. So this was just because of the pandemic restrictions. I mean, I haven't met any of my cohort members or the organizers in person, but we just got to be such great friends. And it was just sharing our experiences through storytelling, just learning from each other's cultures, experiences that really enhanced everything, honestly. And why I emphasize so much on virtual cafe is just the friendships we formed. So it's been months since we graduated from the cohort, and we're still very great friends. We all know each other interest areas. We reach out to them if we see some job opening that would be of interest to them. We ask them how their projects are going, encourage them, and that is invaluable. So that is one of the biggest highlights. And then just the second thing, something that I actually found which was very unique to GPods was the mentor lecture structure. So I'm someone who kind of has jumped in here and there just to enhance my learning and to balance it with my legal practice. And I've tried a bunch of different things. And what stood out to me was the mentor lectures, which were very, very diverse. So you would have people from the UN. So we had Mr. Satya Tripathi, the UNESG, speaking to you, or you would have Mr. Benedict Frank, or you would have the youngest minister of representing Paraguay. So, you had all these diverse things. And then again, just like really diverse perspectives, some people going the charted path, having different degrees and coming at a conclusion, some people doing extremely different things, but charting this unique career path. So you just get this diversity of ideas of people who you would normally call made it in life, but just to different means. And then again, you get this diversity of opinions. Some would say, just go in for the experience, just start somewhere. Someone would say, no, take your education a bit further, do another degree, and just giving you all these different ideas on a platter that you can pick from. And just all of them are so accessible. I have reached out, and you can reach out to most of them. They respond very well to you. So that is something that you cannot at all take for granted. And just quickly to sum it up, this was just the technical side, right? And I'm guessing if you are choosing to go for sustainability, public policy, you are a bit social minded. So you can have this pride of saying, I work in the field of social development, etc., etc. But at the end, you're going to ask yourself, why are you doing it? And then you have these excellent mentors who come in at the very inauguration, like Mr. John Dixon. And for me, the most impressionable was Queen Diambi of the DRC, the traditional queen of the Congolese people, who comes and says that you do it for the people. And that is that as simple as that, maybe you do it for each other. When you see someone who is an embodiment of that, that emotion, it just adds the human side to your knowledge. And I think that was my biggest takeaway, just mixing your humanity, your knowledge, and your experience together just to do something right. So that's what I would say GPODS to me is all about. I'm going to stop here. I'm open to questions. I will also put down all my details on the chat box. Please do feel free to reach out to me. And again, just a quick reminder, the deadline is tomorrow, 26th of January, 2021. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sulekha. We also have a quick GPODS video just to give you a flavor. So you heard from Sulekha. We also have a video just to show you guys what the fellowship actually looks like before we head to Ishant's lecture. So Aditi, if I may request you to play that lecture. But again, while Aditi plays that, Sulekha, thank you so much. I didn't know that CPA was your favorite course, and I'm happy that I was able to teach that to you. And it was awesome seeing you today. And thanks for saying all those great words.
And Sulekha, I'm not too happy about the fact that CPA was your favorite lecture.
Well, I didn't have any knowledge, so anything that gets thrown at you is always a
well, it's out in the public forum now.
Well,
So,
I don't think any of you are involved in this. For a purely academic exercise because you need a job.
Aditi, I think you'll have to play it again because the screen is not
You're
showing.
all striving for something bigger.
One second.
Because after all, I don't think any of you are involved in this for a purely academic exercise or because you need a job. I wouldn't be here today if that was the case. You're all striving for something bigger.
So how do we make policy?
Policy or some key elements of a good migration policy, what should be?
How to save the planet.
And what are the theories and concepts related to innovation?
Strategic communications and creating effective messages and public campaigns.
So policy is not only a question of making specific environmental legislations, but also in other fields of policy.
What is the scope of environment, how we should not limit it to our understanding of environment, because environment is inclusive of human beings and not the other way around.
That's taken more to a national and international level, because you are then negotiating these in these exchanges between nations and between higher level of state governments in order to achieve the best long-term solution. And long-term, of course, is a broad term because, you know, every country has its own system and has their own system of government, and whether or not it's a 4-year elected president or a lifetime king or queen, you know, is up to the country. But ultimately, year by year, the United Nations and just governments in general that interact want to reassess where they stand. And all of this can be seen through the lens of sustainability, because if you aren't considering sustainability as you form your arguments, then what are you really going towards?
Just because we don't have a lot of opportunities just because of the fact of our gender. And this is something that people don't really talk about. So normally when I talk to my friends, we don't talk about how unfair it is that we aren't getting certain opportunities because of gender. And so we don't really realize how widespread it is.
Corporates, their battleground is highly capitalist. So as far as with corporates is concerned, I think government agencies will have to intervene to keep them in check when it comes to charging for the resources from the earth. I mean, paying for the resources of the earth, because I think it has gone non-built since a long time now, and
the kind of flexibility that we are looking at into providing, you know, youth with the opportunity to, you know, do what they really want to do in terms of sports, in terms of, you know, theater, literature, arts, etc. I think all of those pieces could really be solidified, and that angle will be a life-changing, not life-changing, sorry, it would be a big change in the Indian policy sphere as well. And because the stats are also in favor of the youth, the country has a lot of youth. I think it would be appreciated, and it could be a stepping stone for a lot of youths to come into the policy sector and see how policy defines your life and day-to-day living very differently, right? Because in India, the culture is that we don't really understand how policy and life is interlinked, right? But in the US, I mean, or in some of the foreign countries, the youth is aware of like how policy influences them.
Thank you so much, Aditi. If anyone has any questions about the fellowship, then we'll be more than happy to answer them towards the end, and we are happy to stay on for a bit and answer those. But if anyone has any particular questions to Sulekha, maybe we can take those right now, if that's okay with you, Sulekha.
Of course.
Sure. So if you have a question, would you want to raise your hand and then we'll unmute you, or you could probably post your question. We'll probably just take a couple of those right now before we move on to Ishan's lecture. All right, I'm just going to wait for another few seconds. Okay, then we'll probably take questions towards the end if there are any, and Ishan is here. So Ishan, over to you. All right.
All right. Thank you so much, Arpit, and thank you so much, Sulekha. For those of you who have been here and who do not know Sulekha well, this is the first time her internet has not crashed during a meeting. And it so happens that my internet crashed during the meeting. So I think she's just passed on her internet connection to others. Let me first, and thank you for being driven towards environment to actually sign up for a certificate workshop, and where we would be discussing so many of the things that Arpit has already discussed. And my job here about the lecture that I'm about to deliver is relating to some of the core concepts of environmental law. Now, those of the GPODS fellows who are here and hopefully some of you would sign up for it too, would know that I usually begin at level 0. So we'll start with what really is environment before we delve into the laws and policy of environment. So a couple of housekeeping rules. It'll be great if you can put yourself on mute. Please do enter your questions in the chat box if you have any. If we're not able to respond to your questions, you can always write to us. We have put in our email IDs in the chat box as well. And that being said, we have about an hour, a little less than an hour. So I'll try and steamroll through the presentation. And hopefully you'll want to learn more as GPODS fellows in the future. So as I said, before we delve into, I also have to introduce myself. I completely forgot about that. I am an environmental law by qualification. I'm also professor of environmental law and regulation at a couple of universities in India, and also the co-founder of Envipol and the co-director of GPODS. An environmental professional, while I am, as I mentioned, an environmental lawyer at the heart of it all, but recently I've been delving into environmental science, environmental finance, climate risk modeling and such things. So if there are any questions that you might have in relation to that, also happy to take those up. But I have to be conscious of the fact that the 150 people who are in attendance today, not everyone is at the same level of environmental policy, consciousness, or education or awareness as the other. So we'll start at the very beginning. And as you get to know me longer, and I hope all of you do, you'll realize that I am a bit of a fan of astrophysics as well. And Carl Sagan, who's a famous, I think he called himself a science educator, had this very interesting quote. And it read, "If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe." So if we have to understand environmental laws and policies specifically in relation to the Pareto-Bayes principle, we first have to understand what is environment to begin with. So I did a bit of a research of my own a few months back, and I looked at the various definitions that exist of environment around the globe. So environment in some definitions means human beings. Quite intuitively, it also means water. It includes air in some definitions. It includes land in some definitions. It includes other living creatures and biodiversity related organisms in others. It includes plants and trees, shrubs and herbs, and a bunch of other things. I already mentioned organisms, but microorganisms are a very important part of environment as well, as you will notice from the definitions, various definition components that I put on the screen. There's also this element of property, and it becomes very, very interesting when you go and add the element of property to the definition of the term environment. There's also the overarching theme of interrelationship amongst all of these things. So you have human beings, water, air, land, living creatures, plants, microorganisms, property, and their interrelationship amongst each other, within each other. And that should kind of be a very, very holistic definition of environment from around the globe. So these are the elements in our definitions of environment. But this is where I draw your attention to the commonalities of these components of this definition. So there's water, there's air. Both of them are extremely important for human being survival. There's land, without which human beings cannot survive. There are plants which make the diet of certain human beings. There are microorganisms that lead to our healthy living. So as you know, that there's certain kind of bacteria and enzymes and other microorganisms that are imperative for human beings to survive. There's property, which is a human creation, so to speak. And that also is included in the definition of environment. And then there's this interrelationship amongst all of these. So if there's one commonality in this master key definition that I've compiled from all across the world, the commonality is human beings, right? Water is important for human beings. Air is important for human beings. So is land and other things. And why I take you through this master key definition of all things environment is because we need to realize that there's something missing in this definition. This definition of environment, as our legal philosophers have spoken about and as our laws laid down, is not technically the definition of environment for environment. It's a definition of environment for human beings. And this is where all of our policies that follow kind of take a bit of a detour, because we do not define environment for what it is. We define environment for what it is supposed to be for human beings. And that's what's missing from this, as I mentioned, the master key definition. Now, why I encourage you to think of environment beyond your studied and settled notions of environment is because mining is a big issue with environment, as you know. Energy scarcity is a big issue of environment. Metallurgy is a big issue of environment. And there's this asteroid called Psyche 16, which, as you can read off the screen, has about 8,000 quadrillion pounds worth of metals such as gold, platinum, iron, nickel, which is planning to be mined by SpaceX and NASA. This is from a news report in The Guardian, if I'm not wrong. We can fact check that. But the point is that technically, if you look at the definitions that we have already seen of environment, that is of human beings, water, land, air, and such, this asteroid does not fall within our domain of environment and within our definition of environment. So the first thing I invite you to do is challenge the definition of environment. Is it everything that we're told it is? Or is it something greater? Is it something that would affect not just the stratosphere and the biosphere and our atmosphere, but things beyond our reach? Is that the real definition of environment? If tomorrow the asteroid is mined and we all become billionaires overnight, would that mean that we were not affected by it at all? Or would it be almost obvious that such mining would have its own consequences? Now, what would be those consequences is a matter of separate research altogether. But my point of putting you through this exercise of thinking about this specific asteroid is to challenge your underlying definition of environment and not limiting it to the worldview that is given to us of environment. Don't limit it to water available on Earth. Don't limit it to the air around us. I know these are our priorities at this point, but I'll come to why us defining environment is almost arrogant, because we are but a part of environment and not the other way around. So these are some of the questions that I pose, and I understand that because of the structure of this talk, it'll be difficult to have a bit of a Q&A at this point. We'll probably be open to questions at the end of the lecture. But the question that I posed during this part of the lecture is, what are the 5 or 4 most common elements in the universe, not just on Earth, not just within ourselves? What are the 5 most common elements within this universe? And for those of you who do not know this, the answer is hydrogen, helium, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, right? Now, if I change this question a little and I ask you, what are the 5 most common elements in human beings, or 4 most common elements of human beings? The answer to that is hydrogen. Helium is not, because helium anyway is an inert gas. Nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon. So from there, you can see that we, or humans, who went on to define environment to mean X, Y, Z, are but mere absolutely insignificant parts of what we term as environment around us. If we look at it from the point of view of a universe, we have the same most common elements as that of universe. So we cannot differentiate ourselves to know something more or be bigger than what surrounds us. And that is my first lesson when we deal with environment, and when we deal with environmental law as we go forward. That you must first realize that environment is a lot bigger than the definition that we can ever subsume and come up with, because we are but parts of environment. Now, another example that I usually take is, imagine the human life timeline and is laid onto a football field that is a timeline of the planet. Okay,
Now, if this football field that you see on the screen is the age of Earth, our planet, what do you think is the distance till which human beings have been here? Now, this is, as I said, another question that I usually pose in my class. And the answers could be the midfield, the goal post, the free kick line, the penalty kick line, and all of those answers. Truth is, if the whole of the football field is the length has been rolled into this length of this football field, the whole of the human civilization of planet Earth has been rolled onto this football field, then human beings are 1/16th of an inch, or of the thickness of a blade of grass, as opposed to that of the life of this planet. So why I again mention that is I want all of you to realize that humans are but 1/16th of an inch of this planet. And then this planet is obviously predated by the Big Bang, the universe, and all of those things. So we are even more minuscule on that timeline. And the reason why, again, I go into these questions before we get into the hardcore discussion of environmental law and policy is because I want you to realize that if we are worth, or our time spent, or human civilization's time spent on this planet is equivalent to the thickness of a blade of grass, and then to assume that we can define everything that has pre-existed and will exist after us or during our times is a bit of a stretch. And that is why you should always be conscious of what you are defining and what you want to get out of that definition. So first, let's challenge what is environment. Now, for any discussion on environmental law, you must also first understand what are the basic philosophies on environment. And usually I do devote almost an hour to this portion of the lecture, but since we're short on time, I'll just run through it and talk about two major philosophies of environment. One is, I hope most of you are aware of, is the anthropocentrism or the anthropocentric approach to environmental ethics. And the reason and the logic behind the anthropocentric approach, or the meaning of anthropocentric approach, is that I am at the center of it all. Humans are at the center of it all. So should I deforest or should I pollute that water is simply dependent on whether I can do that or I cannot do that. Should I do that? Should I not do that? All the reasons and all the cost-benefit analysis that plays through under anthropocentrism, or an Anthropocene approach, as some of you might have heard, is with humans being at the center of the decision making. So we do not care if environment will benefit from it or not. All we care about is whether human beings or I will benefit from it. And that's an anthropocentric approach. Now, anthropocentric approach itself takes a lot of meanings when you deep dive into the philosophy and the history of the philosophy. But as I write in the slide, much of the anthropocentrism speaks of humans creating safeguards to protect species as a means to exert control. So because I am the dominant species, I will be exerting control over everything around us. Before I move on to the next slide, let me also request all of the participants to please mute themselves. If there are noises that happen in the background, it is very distracting for the presenter. So again, I'd like to request everyone to just mute themselves. So that's the anthropocentric approach, that humans are at the center of it all. And again, this is the part of the question answer part of my slides again, where I basically ask people to guess where these photos are from. Now, some of you might know this, but this is from the 1960s, 70s Los Angeles smog situation. And for those of you who visited Delhi, New Delhi, which is where I'm speaking from currently, or those of you who've visited Beijing in the last decade, you probably know that there's a similar situation happening all around the globe in some of the major cities around the world. And I take the anthropocentric approach example to tell you that air pollution did not appear out of nowhere. Air pollution was, if you take the circumstance of these photos in the presentation, you'll realize that there was a threshold at which the smog situation became so bad that you could not see beyond 10 meters, or you had to wear gas masks to walk in public, as the gentleman in the photo does. But air pollution was already existing. It's just that you did not seem to notice it as much, or you did not care about it as much, because it was not affecting your visibility, or it was not affecting your lungs as much. But when the smog situation worsens and becomes as it did in LA in the 1960s, you come up with legislations and you come up with a bunch of things that can stop the smog situation and better the air quality of the city. And as for some of you who might have visited LA in the recent times, it's a lot better now. Now, what is that an example of? Now, this is a classic example of an anthropocentric approach. I do not care if there's air pollution in the air, because it does not affect my visibility, and for all I know, it does not affect my lungs. But when the smog situation becomes this bad, and there's smoke all around and you can barely see people around you, is when it starts affecting you, and it starts affecting your visibility and maybe your health and the health of your loved ones. And it stares you in the face, this air pollution situation. And then you realize that, no, I have to do something about this. And I come up with legislation, I come up with law, I come up with policies, I come up with various technological interventions which help the air pollution situation. Now, when you do that, that is an example of an Anthropocene approach, because if it affects human beings, then it's an issue. And that is the approach you take when it comes to all the major cities around the globe. What is the other approach? An approach that is better understood by environmentalists as a more humane approach, ironically speaking. Now, is an approach in which, unlike anthropocentrism, which means that humans are at the center of it all, ecocentrism proposes that environment itself is at the center of it all. So environment is not just an instrument through which you derive benefits, but it has an inherent value of itself. So a tree is a tree not because its timber is useful for human beings, but a tree is a tree because tree is as important as any other human being around you. And that's basically, in a nutshell, the ecocentrism approach. Now, I'd love to discuss this further, but as I said, this whole lecture is a race against time, and I hope that those of you who are more interested in this do sign up for the GPODS Fellowship. As we mentioned earlier, the last date for application is tomorrow. Now, one example that we need to take when we talk of ecocentric approach is the Wanganui River in New Zealand. And recently, over the last few years, you've seen that in the news, you might have noticed that the Wanganui River and the villages around it have been given the title of guardians of the river. And why that is because they have considered that Wanganui River in itself has an inherent value. And that inherent value is why the river is. It's not so that the human beings can fish off it or live around it or drink from it, just because the river has an inherent value of itself, an intrinsic value of itself. And that's a very good definition of ecocentrism. You can broaden this definition and talk of the mountains in Bolivia, and you can talk of other examples from around the globe. But ecocentrism approach basically shows you that environment is not limited to our definition of environment, or environment does not have water, air, land, property, and their interrelationship, but it's a lot bigger than our understanding of environment. And as I mentioned, during the fellowship, we cover other philosophies and ethical approaches in detail. We do not have time to go through all of them. I invite you all to discuss this with us. But taking you back to my first slide, you must realize that environment is so much bigger than us, and sustainable development, which is only an arm of environment, is so much bigger than us that for us to assume the responsibility of being able to define something that we barely understand to its fullest is not just inapt, but also arrogant and smug. So that being said, let's move on to some of the important principles of, in fact, before I do that, let me also tell you that while I do say that environmentalists agree that ecocentric approach is the right approach to take, an anthropocentric approach, which, as I described, is human beings at the center of it all, is the wrong approach to take. But can you discard the anthropocentric approach throughout? Now, the reason why we have structured this certificate workshop in a way that we have a game theory of environment cooperation before this lecture is because we want you to understand that game theory is basically riding on people's inherent beliefs and decision-making processes, and then coming to a conclusion as to what would be the most conducive solution to a specific problem. Anthropocentric approach, when you consider that, can be very useful as well, because while humans must not be seen as the center of it all, or must not be seen as the know-it-all, do-it-all, have-it-all of the universe, which is what we consider ourselves to be at this point, especially when you go through our legislations and the punitive sentences and the civil law consequences and everything. There is a certain place for anthropocentrism. And this goes back to Arpit's lecture on game theory. It also goes back to the very basics of behavioral economics and behavioral psychology. Now, while environment has its own value, as we saw under the ecocentric approach, or it is also called the biocentric approach, environment can be leveraged, and protection and conservation of environment can be leveraged if you think of anthropocentric approach as an element of behavioral change. So how does that work? That works by telling you, now if I come to you and I take someone from this audience, for example, let me see. I take Avinash as an example. Now Avinash wants to disrupt the environment. And Avinash stays in a society and he has neighbors, and his neighbors are into electricity conservation. And what I start doing then is I am the government of the state or the province in which Avinash stays. And I start delivering to each of them electricity bills, which compares their electricity conservation or electricity bills with that of their neighbors. So it's not just Avinash who will be receiving an electricity bill, but he would also be getting a data of how he has performed against his neighbors on conservation. Now, so what you are doing is, while you're talking about energy efficiency and electricity conservation, energy conservation, but you are putting it in terms of anthropocentrism. So I am giving Avinash the impetus to reduce his energy consumption by telling him that, listen, your neighbors are actually saving more than you are by by using less electricity or investing in energy conservation devices. So through this anthropocentric approach, I've told Avinash that you are the center of this conversation and you are the center of everything environment. And if you start changing your actions, you will be better than your neighbor. So to say that there's absolutely no place for anthropocentrism in this world because ecocentrism is the better place to be or the better approach to be, I would say yes. Ecocentrism is the better approach to have. However, to change behaviors and to change actions of the populace of this globe towards making the world more environmentally friendly, you might have to employ tools such as the game theory, as Arpit eloquently described in his lecture, to bring about changes of actions. Now, we have a couple of GPODS fellows who had come up with interesting ideas, and I'd be happy to discuss those with you separately. Maybe if you become a part of the GPODS cohort, we're going to discuss these in details. But again, due to the paucity of time, I'll just run through the other topics that we have lined for our discussion. Now, what you see on your screen, 4 environmental concepts, is basically a lie. Why I say that is, environment has infinite number of concepts. The theory of general relativity of 1905 or the theory of special relativity of 1915 that Einstein came up with could be argued as environmental concepts because they talk about how how gravity works and how different forces interact with each other. Gravity itself can be called an environmental concept if one has to extend the definition. There's the public trust doctrine, which I have not mentioned in the slide, but that makes up for a very, very important enviro-legal concept. But because this lecture is about the polluter pays principle, I'll quickly cover these four and explain to you what these are, and then move on to the crux of this discussion. Now, as you can see, I have chosen four very important concepts to just give you a bit of a bird's eye view of what we're dealing with when we deal with environmental laws and environmental policies. Let's start with the precautionary principle. Now, precautionary principle, to put it extremely simply, means that if there's scientific uncertainty as to the consequences of a certain action, so if you're setting up an industry and you're not sure whether it will pollute or not, then the precautionary principle would govern and would say that, listen, in case you do not know whether it will pollute or not, let's err on the side of caution and let's not set up the industry. And that's basically the precautionary principle. So in case of an scientific uncertainty, you are implored not to go ahead with the action that you're proposing to undertake. It favors status quo. So it would advise you against undertaking an activity which might, in the face of uncertainty, cause irretrievable harm to the environment, or pollution, or devastating effects on the atmosphere around us. So that's the precautionary principle. What is sustainable development? Because this makes a lot of our discussions around the globe are about sustainable development, and all of us think that this is the right way to go. But what is sustainable development? And this creates a lot of issues when you start discussing how do you define sustainable development. Now, in 1988, the Brundtland Commission submitted its report, and it kind of defined sustainable development, and we're going to run through it as we speak. I'll move on to the question of and the concept of intergenerational equity. Now, those of you who are lawyers, or those of you who have studied environment at some stage in your lives, you probably have heard of intergenerational equity as a concept. And intergenerational equity is the crux on which we intend to fight climate change. SDG 13, climate action, is based quite prominently on the concept of intergenerational equity, which is that we are basically mere borrowers of our resources. So we have borrowed the resources, natural resources around us. We have not inherited them, and we are not owners of it. We are mere borrowers of the natural resources, which we borrowed from our previous generations, and we have to hand them over in the same state that they exist today to our future generations. And that's intergenerational equity. So there's an element of equity in relation to generations that come and go, but the natural resources should be remaining in the same state as they are today. And that's basically the concept. Again, I am simplifying it due to the paucity of time. And again, I'm happy to have this conversation with all of you separately, probably as a part of the GPODS cohort. Now, what is the elephant in the room? The polluter pays principle. To put it very simply, polluter pays principle is just that. Now, I always say this in my lectures that environmentalists are not very creative when it comes to coining terms. So precautionary principle is quite literally being precautioned against something. Intergenerational equity is quite literally equity amongst and between generations. Sustainable development is development that could be sustainable. And finally, polluter pays principle is when you pollute, you ought to pay for it. So the name itself is self-explanatory, but it becomes, if you think about the history of the sustainable, of the precautionary polluter pays principle, you realize that it wasn't all hunky-dory throughout. So polluter pays principle started as a concept being coined by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, one of the most energy-intensive industries have been represented in this organization. So it's almost counterintuitive, but it started out as a concept saying that when environmental pollution remediation of environmental pollution costs you more than polluting the environment, then you're actually making a loss. And hence, when you make that loss, you end up paying for the pollution you have caused, and hence polluter pays principle came into being. Now, according to this principle, at least when it was coined in the late 1970s, it was kind of assumed that the price of a good would be the total cost of its production and the labor that has gone into this production and the cost of raw materials. But there was also this term, as you can see on your screen in green, and it said it also includes the cost of resources used. Now, when we say, and this is a legal mind speaking and asking you to think more in terms of legal philosophy and policy, that what are these resources used? Is it just the raw materials? We've already accounted for that. How about when you're manufacturing a certain product and it leads to smoke, and that smoke goes up into your air, and that air absorbs the carbon, and so does everything around us. That's a resource used as well. So the price of your good eventually would include within it the price of the resources that you have used, or some might argue misused, to come up with that product. Before we get into a detailed discussion of polluter pays principle, I'd also like to touch upon this concept of strict liability as it is considered in the West, and absolute liability in Asian countries, majorly in India. Now, the concept of strict liability or absolute liability came into being when people realize that if there's an inherently dangerous activity that you carry out, and you realize that just by indulging in that activity, you are endangering everyone around you. And when that mishap does happen, because you were aware of the danger, and people and environment and society around you gets impacted by your act of ignorance or your act of awareness that such an activity can cause loss, then the court said that the other person does not have to prove that you had an evil intention, or you had the intention to do this, or you had knowledge of this happening. All that he has to prove, or all that she has to prove, is that you as a person were aware of the hazardous nature of this activity, and that's about it. You're proven guilty. And that's strict and absolute liability, again oversimplified. Now, why is this different from polluter pays principle? Because polluter pays principle almost requires you to, one, make up the loss that you have caused, but also there can be, as we'll discuss over this slide, there can be instances where you know that I will destroy the environment and I will make up for it. But what if the profit that I gain out of destroying the environment is more than the loss I undertake by remediating the environment? And that, for a long time by corporations around the globe, was considered the optimum level of pollution. As you can see on the graph here, the benefits of the pollution are, say, this much, and the cost of remediation is on this axis. Now, simply, if you're able to strike a balance and still make a profit of this much, then you'll carry on polluting as long as the cost of remediation does not go above the cost of benefit from pollution. And this was simply a very invincible concept, as I say, and a very Anthropocene understanding of polluter pays principle. Now, as you go into the debates of polluter pays principles, one of the biggest disadvantages or highest criticisms of polluter pays principle is, and now it is being applied to the concept of carbon tax, if some of you have heard of carbon tax, it is that it gives the rich an option to pollute as long as they're profiting more from it, and they can just pay for their losses. So that's the biggest criticism, and that's where the concept of optimum level of pollution, which was, I would argue, wrongly realized over the last few decades. Now, as you can see that this now depends on what is the spending power of a corporate, or what is the spending power of someone who's undertaking an activity. It does not depend on the purchasing power as it would be for any other good that goes into the market. Spending power, because if I can spend an X amount on remediation of pollution or of environment, and if I can still make a profit of X plus 10 out of carrying on that activity, then I will go ahead with that activity because it's net profit for me. Does it also give you the de facto right to discharge? So you must also understand that polluter pays does not say that you should not undertake this activity. It says if this activity is undertaken and you end up carrying out pollution, or you end up destroying the environment around you, you have to make up for the loss of the environment. Now, there are a lot of problems with what is the cost of that loss. And this is why I always take my favorite example, which is the cost of a tiger and the cost of the last tiger. Now, if you are carrying on an activity and you realize that if I carry on this activity and there's a tiger in the vicinity of my industry, that tiger would die. So the environmental auditors would go through some matrices, will do some modeling, and will come up with the price of that tiger. Now, say the price of that tiger is $1 million, and you realize that by carrying on the activity, you get $2 million. So you can pay for the cost of that tiger. Now, what if that tiger is the last surviving tiger on this planet? The cost of the tiger technically should remain the same. And we'll get into the hypotheticals of how the cost of the tiger actually goes up because it's the last remaining tiger. But it is very difficult to put a number figure on anyone's life, may it be an animal, an organism, a human being. And that is why to come up with the cost that a polluter should pay as compensation to the pollution he or she has caused has been a topic of much debate and constitutes a bit of a gray area in the environmental law and policy circles. Now, what about benefits? What if I can cause $10 worth of pollution, but I'm also providing socioeconomic good for the people in that community? I'll give you an example. Now, I am coming up with a thermal power plant in a biodiverse area. It is obviously going to have environmental consequences. It is probably going to cause pollution, air pollution, discharge into water, plastic waste might go up, nuclear waste, any other kind of waste might go up, depending on what kind of power plant are we building. Now, it is certainly having its environmental cost, but what about the 100,000 people who will get jobs from it? And what about the 200,000 kids who will get education because this new industry has come to town? What about the better health facilities that might come with development of that village or of that rural area? So it becomes a very difficult matrix to put your finger on and see whether the pollution, the costs of environmental pollution outweigh the benefits, the socio-economic benefits or otherwise out of that activity. And that's why polluter pays principle, as I mentioned, continues to be a gray area, and there are some very interesting discussions that we undertake in GPODs when we discuss polluter pays principle. Now, something that I'm sure polluter pays principle is something that all of us have heard of in the past. Something that we do not give enough importance to is the concept of beneficiary pays principle. Now, as I said, environmentalists, environmental legal philosophers generally, when it comes to environment, have not been very, very creative with the words and terminology of things that we use. But beneficiary pays principle is that if your forefathers or if your ancestors plundered a certain natural reserve, made money out of it, settled in some part of the globe and were advantaged because of the pollution that they had caused. They were polluters, and that's the polluter pays principle. But you were born into that family, or you grew up in that society where people had benefited from the pollution that they had caused and obviously become fiscally better placed than others in the society. Now, technically, you are a beneficiary of that pollution, right? And if you are a beneficiary, or if your success is underpinned on the environmental destruction that had been undertaken by your forefathers or your ancestors or your society or your country, it can be equated to colonization. Now, let me put it in perspective. Beneficiary pays principle. I'd again invite all of you to mute yourselves, please. Yeah. Now, if we're talking about the beneficiary pays principle, one second. Now, if you think of colonization, Aditi, can I ask you to put this person in the waiting room, please? I'm unable to concentrate on the lecture. Okay, so colonization. What happens is a certain country comes, colonizes this other country, plunders it, takes its resources, takes its natural resources and other sorts of resources, and goes back to its own land or property or country and lives off the wonderful plunders that have come out of colonizing a certain other country. Now, one of the debates that happens in philosophy and political science is that what if that country is made to pay for the loss of your natural resources today? Just give me a Yes. Sorry, as I mentioned, I was having some issues concentrating because of the constant chatter. Now, if you can put the same analogy to people who have plundered the environment, who have benefited from that pollution, and then gone back, and that benefit has been passed on to One second. Yeah, sorry, as I mentioned, I have a bit of an issue concentrating when people are talking. So if that benefit has been passed on to its future generations, can you hold the present day generations accountable for everything that their forefathers have done? And that's the beneficiary pays principle. So if I take your example, say you come from a part of the world where the society has benefited from plundering the environment around you, and you're better placed than the rest of the civilization because your forefathers were clever enough and wise enough to hone in on the opportunity and plunder the environment and make profit out of it. Would it be all right if I blame you for it? And if I say that under the beneficiary pays principle, you are the beneficiary of that pollution that happened 100 years ago, and hence you will be held liable and you'll have to pay for damages caused to the environment by your forefathers. This is the time I open it up for questions, but again, due to the paucity of time, we will probably take up questions separately over email. Now, this is where it gets very complicated, the whole concept of beneficiary pays principle, because there's this communitarian view, this conservative view that come what may, environment was harmed, someone has to pay for it. Just because we did not have these environmental policies 100 years back does not mean that everyone should go scot-free. And so what? They've passed away now. Their future generations, the polluters' future generations are still benefiting from the profits that they derive out of polluting. And hence, you and your generation and your community should be held liable for the pollution caused by the forefathers. There's also the axiological view. Now, the axiological view or the individualistic view is that polluter, the person who caused the pollution, and pollution itself are two absolutely different entities. And you should hold the polluter accountable only if he is around. You should always hold the pollution accountable even if it is not around. So the axiological view is that you cannot hold an individual accountable for deeds that he never did or she never did. You cannot hold an individual accountable for the environmental pollution caused by people he might not have met. Maybe 3 generations before him, someone might have caused the pollution. That's the individualistic view. Now, we go through some of the philosophers in detail during the GPODS fellowship. But I'll quickly give you an insight into what different philosophies are when it comes to beneficiary pays principle. Now, Edmund Burke, the famous philosopher, has suggested that by virtue of being born and by virtue of death in a particular nation, and I'm simplifying it, you become a part of that nation. And that concept of nationhood does not end with you dying, or that concept of nationhood cannot be taken away just for the mere fact of something having played out a certain way. Similarly, the adverse impacts of pollution that has been caused by your actions does not merely go away because you have passed on or you are no longer around, which means that the nation still carries the debt of the pollution that has been caused by citizens of that nation or the nation itself in case of colonization. Now, Eric Neumayer had a different approach to beneficiary principle, often coming to the same conclusion, but he said that the standard of living that certain societies enjoy today are basically a consequence of the plunder of environment that they have caused in the past. And therefore, the standard of living, the high standard of living that they enjoy today is almost at the cost of environment that was plundered by their forefathers and ancestors, and that's why you should be held accountable. Gosseries, who makes for a very, very interesting study, is basically suggesting that everyone who has benefited through his forefathers, through her forefathers or ancestors, is basically today a free rider, and hence should be held accountable, and no one should be let to be a free rider and enjoy life as it is without any consequences of indirect or direct actions. Now, Simon Caney, a very famous environmental philosopher of the University of Oxford, he has a different view in this. And as I mentioned, the axiological view earlier, he is of the opinion that the pay bit of polluter pays principle should relate to pollution and not the polluter. So you should, as they say, you should hate the sin, not the sinner. Similarly, you should only hold pollution, the act of pollution, accountable, not the polluter per se. I'm simplifying it again. Now, there's Professor Derek Parfait, who has written quite rigorously on population ethics, and he has come up with the non-identity principle. In fact, he has a 3-volume book series in which he discusses everything from rationality to justice and such. And I invite all of you to read it. But my interpretation of one of the concepts of non-identity principle is that what if you are born by virtue of everything that has led to that point? So what if there were no railways? Maybe your parents had never met if there were no railways. If there are railways, that has had a certain environmental footprint. It has increased the carbon footprint. It has, led to so much development and pollution, just the laying down of railway tracks and everything. But if that had not happened, maybe you wouldn't be here in the first place. So where do you draw the line of being almost a cause of environmental harm or a result of the cause of environmental harm? And that's a very interesting question that comes up when you discuss population ethics. Past emissions and intergenerational debt is basically this movie where I've taken this screenshot from, where basically you have to see that whether the dead people or our forefathers or ancestors, and for their acts, can we be held accountable? Is it the emissions of a particular country that has led to such plunder, or is it the people, or is it the generations that came after those people? And that's the basic debate that happens. And for you to understand what are the pollution laws today, you must also understand each of these concepts and then apply these concepts to the laws around you. Professor Otterstorm, who's again a very famous philosopher, he was of the opinion that you inherit a debt, and that debt could be atmospheric, that could be your current living standard by virtue of what has happened in the past, by your past, or what has been done by your past generations in the past. Now, these things will keep on developing as we go ahead, and I am almost out of time. So what I'll try and do is leave you with a specific question and also try and just tease you with a bit of a discussion on it. When polluter pays principle almost intuitively makes sense, it says that, you know, if I take one of the participants' names, say we have Abhishek Yadav with us, and Abhishek Yadav has caused certain pollution, and he should be held accountable for the pollution that he's caused. That's quite simple. Now, what if certain person from the large family tree, maybe 10 generations earlier, in Abhishek Yadav's family tree had caused certain pollution? Should he be held liable? And if we do not have the policy approaches today to make him liable for something that has happened in the past, so why even get into this discussion of beneficiary-based principle? Does it turn out to be just a philosophical discussion, nothing more to it? I argue that that's not true. And why is that not true? Because the difference technically between polluter pays principle and beneficiary pays principle is just the timeline. Polluter pays principle as applied today is happening as we speak. Beneficiary pays principle has already happened. The cause or the act of pollution has happened, the act of plunder or devastation of environment has happened. And then that's why some people say that it has happened and you can't do anything about it. Now, what if today Abhishek or I decide that we're going to pollute the environment around us, and we are going to move to some place where we cannot be discovered, and we have already taken the gains out of that pollution. Now, if you change the timelines here and you realize that for a generation later, my kids or Abhishek's kids will or should be held liable because we plundered the environment. And hence you have to look at beneficiary pays principle almost from a reverse angle to realize that beneficiary pays principle is just on a different timeline. Polluter concept, the legal understanding of polluter pays principle and beneficiary pays principle and the other major principles that we discussed during the GPODS fellowship, for you to understand what are the policies that are taking place today. Now, the buzzwords, as I mentioned earlier, are carbon tax. The buzzwords are cap and trade. The buzzwords are equity-based model. The buzzwords are nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement of UNFCCC. If you have to understand what the carbon tax is, you also should understand what the polluter pays principle is, because carbon tax is technically the tax that is imposed on you for emitting X amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And similarly, polluter pays principle is the cost imposed on you for polluting to an X amount the environment around you. So these are the basic principles that one needs to understand to develop an understanding of environmental principles that play out. Now, we have during these lectures bit of time, and I do apologize. In fact, I invite you to carry on the conversation with me and with Envipol and GPODS. You have the chat box available to you. You can write to us. You can also mail us at info@gpods.org. And tomorrow is the deadline, as I told you, for the GPODS fellowship. So do apply. We have got a tremendous response from all around the globe. We have about 40 different mentors from national governments, from the United Nations, from environmental organizations such as the International Union for Conservation of Nature. We have deans and directors of some of the biggest universities around the globe. So I invite you to all go to www.gpods.org, check out a website, and please do apply in time. Again, I could not be more pressing with this appeal that we have only 24 hours left for the applications. So please do apply, and please do reach out to us in case you have any queries or doubts or any other thing. Thank you.
And when you're applying, please do mention that you attended this workshop so that we know that you're already committed towards our mission. And we'll be sending you out the certificates in the next 7 days. Some of you will start receiving them as early as tomorrow or even today. But then in the next 7 days, you will certainly be receiving your certificates of attendance. And thank you, everybody who joined from different parts of the world. Good evening, good day, and good morning to whoever you are. Yes, and to answer Anandita's questions, yes, we are offering partial scholarships at the GPODS Fellowship. Absolutely. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining in, and hi to everyone from different parts of the world. Please
Thank you so much,
keep the
Christopher from
conversation
Nigeria.
going.
Thank you so
Please keep
much.
the conversation going. Our pleasure, our pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well done, sir.
And I'm putting down the email IDs. Pleasure, pleasure. We're putting down the email IDs in the chat box. If you want to reach out to us directly, you could do that as well. And we'll keep you posted about any other events that are being planned in the future. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Want to end the...
Thank you.